Good evening. Welcome again to Biblical Insights. This evening we're going to start out by looking at Psalm 1. In the next several sessions I want to give some insights from several of the Psalms, and I thought it was appropriate we just start with Psalm number 1. I call the title of this session, and I guess we could call the title of the psalm, The Man Who Has It Made. So now, think of a person you know that from all appearances really has it made. Now, if you're a teen, it might be a person maybe that has the nicest car or the best-looking girlfriend or is most popular in his class. If you're a family man, maybe it's the person with the biggest and the best house and the prettiest lawn and the nicest family. Or maybe if you're a college student or a school student, it might be the graduating class. If you're a working man, office or company, maybe it's the president of the company or some executive. Or if you're like I am, if you're a preacher or religious leader, it might be another pastor who has the biggest church, greatest congregation, or the district superintendent or the bishop or somebody like that. So that's, we think of those terms of the one who has it made. But now, the Bible tells us about the man who really has it made. It uses the expression blessed or blessed is the man. Now, if you look up the meaning of the word blessed, it means happy, fortunate, prosperous, or enviable. I like the way Lloyd John Ogilvie expresses it. He just says congratulations. So let's look. First of all, the psalm only has 6 verses, and I want to look at the first 3 for this. So let's read it. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night. And he shall be like a tree planted by rivers of water, that bringeth forth his fruit in season. His leaf also shall not wither, and whatsoever he doeth shall prosper. Now, I've read from the King James, or the Authorized Version, because I memorized it that way a long time ago. It's more familiar. But they all say the same thing. So, first of all, verse 1 talks about the discipline of the man who has it made. The discipline. You see, this man we're talking about, the blessed man, is happy in what he does not do. Notice all 3 times that first verse. He walketh not, standeth not, sitteth not. Let's look at that verse one more time. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. So, in a general sense, discipline is the ability to control our conduct using principles and things that are right, rather than the typical American way of controlling our conduct through impulses, desires, or social pressure, anything like that. It's basically the ability to subordinate or put those things in second place and control by what is really right. So let's look at those 3 things. The discipline of the man who has it made. The first thing we notice is that he walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly. So the disciplined man, the blessed man, chooses his influences. You know, we are changed, we are formed by those that we hang out with whom we associate. Henry Ford once said, "My best friend is the one who brings out the best in me." Remember that old saying that said, "You'll be the same 5 years from now except for the books you read and the friends you choose." So the godly man controls, he chooses those influences. Walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly. Secondly, it tells us that he chooses his environment, nor standeth in the way. In other words, he doesn't hang out with him. He doesn't stay with him. For example, if you're hanging out with a gossip, you're going to be labeled as a gossip. People see a garbage can, they put garbage in it. Now, the environment of the man who is blessed is a Christian social life. You might say a church environment, but those where he's associating with people, standing with people who have similar morals and similar standards. And that's why it's so important that we have a Christian home. The next thing it says in verse 1, he keeps his attitudes helpful. It says, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. Even the culture we live in knows the importance of having a right mental attitude. And you know, a critical spirit is an attitude that will lead to spiritual deadness. If you want to be distressed, start looking inside ourselves. If you want to be defeated, look back. If you want to be distracted, look around. If you want to be dismayed, look ahead. We can especially see that today as we look at what people say the future holds. But if you want to be delivered, look to Jesus Christ. If you want to be delighted, look up. So he chooses his influences. Now, notice in that verse there are sets of three. First of all, he's walking, he walketh, which is kind of a casual or passing association. The next step is standing, which is a continued fellowship. And finally, the third is he sitteth in the seat. That kind of implies permanence or being at home in that situation. So 3, walketh, standeth, sitteth. But now notice the company, the 3 levels of company. The ungodly first, the sinner, and the scornful. So there's 3 steps away from that position of being blessed. 1 is a coolness to God, secondness, a callousness to sin, and 3rd, criticism to others. Now the second thing we notice, and let's look at verse number 2 at this point, is the delight of the man who has it made. We talked about the discipline, now the delight of the man who has it made. So let's read it. His delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night. His delight is in the law of the Lord. Now, when I say the word law, the first thing we think about is commandments and punishment and severity. But for the Hebrew mind, the word Torah, which is what they use, was more than just commandments. It stands for the entire revealed way of life contained in the Hebrew Scriptures and the prophets. And today it includes the teachings of Jesus Christ. So his delight is in the truth that God gives us, not just the commandments, but everything about the relationship we have with Jesus Christ and God the Father. The Christian today finds happiness in the total way of life, the total way of the Christian life. This happiness, you can't just find it in the ways that we come up with ourselves, but in the revealed will of God, That saying says, Bible bred, Bible led, Bible fed. Now, notice the second part of that verse. In it, he meditates day and night. Now, this doesn't mean he sits with a Bible in his hand all the day and all night, but it also means in those good days and bad days, he's always in touch. Now, one of the things, devotions are implied here. Janet just read to me this afternoon that in over 2 million Christians, only 19% read their Bible every day. Now, that isn't a picture of what we're looking at here. He meditates in it. You see, real spiritual growth requires study of God's Word. Communicating with God, applying those principles that we learn from His Word to our life. It's a communication, but it's also an application. Thirdly, verse number 3, the destiny of the man who has it made. The discipline, the delight, and the destiny. So let's look again at the screen here. And he shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that bringeth forth his fruit in his season. His leaf shall not wither, and whatsoever he doeth shall prosper. In other words, he has a purpose in life. I remember hearing a story, I think it was in a sermon somewhere, about this young high school student that was talking about what he wanted out of life. He said, I'm going to graduate from high school, and then I'm going to go to college, and I'm going to stay there to get my doctor's degree. And the man he was talking to says, well, what then? And he says, well, then I'm going to get me a good job with my doctor's degree, and I'm going to do my best, and I'm going to make a difference in this world. I'm going to get me a nice house, a nice car, a big nice family, and just enjoy life. And the guy says, but what then? He says, well, then I'm going to work until I can retire. I'm going to build up a good retirement program, and then I'm going to retire, and I'm going to travel, and I'm going to enjoy life and just relax. And the guy says, what then? You see, it all comes down to what then. But the psalmist says that he will have a purpose. He's like a tree planted firmly. Now, first of all, he's planted. There's a definite beginning and a purpose in his life. And it's implied, as I read the study around it, that he's not only planted, but he's taken care of. He's tended. And his purpose was to bear fruit in season. We're talking now about spiritual fruit. He has beauty in his life. It says his leaf will not wither. It's kind of like the evergreen or maybe a palm tree. Every time you look, they're green and pretty, not just when conditions are favorable. They're green when the other trees have faded and lost their leaves. I remember one time driving to Colorado Springs across the western part of Nebraska, where most of the land is pretty dry, and I looked off in the distance and I could see green trees and maybe even green. There was a green streak, and I knew without even a second thought that there was some water over there. There was a river, I'm sure. So trees don't pick the valleys in which to grow, but the valleys become beautiful because they are there and the river is their source of life. So he lives from his hidden resources. Sometimes as I looked across that desert to those trees growing, I didn't see the river. And sometimes they're even subterranean aquifers or rivers, but the tree has deep roots. There's a hidden strength there. The most notable character of the Christians that were my childhood heroes, their faith was a quiet strength. It didn't make a lot of noise. They weren't really spectacular, but there was a solidarity there. There was something strong about them. And they were strong independent of what was going on around them. So he lives from hidden resources. So his life is a life of success. It says, whatever he doeth shall prosper. So he's successful at all the phases of accomplishing God's purpose. The godly man is successful in accomplishing the purpose for which he was planted. Finally, it says his life is known by the Lord. Now, when it says his life is known by the Lord, it means more than a mental acknowledgement or a mental realization. Knowing in the Bible is a concrete relationship, a personal sense of caring, guiding, directing, and it includes approval. So his life is known by the Lord. Now, the second thing I want to talk about in the last half of this psalm, only 6 verses long, the difference between the man who's blessed and the ungodly. Let's read together those second 3 verses. There are only 6 verses, remember. So the second 3 verses. The ungodly are not so, but are like the chaff that the wind driveth away. Therefore the ungodly shall not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knoweth the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. And so you see, first of all, in that first verse I read, there's disorder instead of discipline. He's not like a tree, but he's like the chaff that the wind drives away. There's no solidarity. There's no firmness. The ungodly man is never steady, and it seems like constantly searching, never satisfied. So there's disorder instead of discipline for the ungodly man. Secondly, it says in the 5th verse, there's denial in judgment. He cannot stand. And the picture we get is a person under trial who has no place to stand. He's guilty. He can't stand when he's condemned by God himself. He can't stand to be pronounced justified. In other words, there's no justification. So in the final judgment, he will not stand. But I think there's another meaning that he can't stand in the gradual sifting of the everyday life of the human character. In other words, he's wishy-washy. He can't stand, and he's blown by every wind of doctrine, every desire of his heart. So there's an unsteadiness. And when it comes to the final judgment, he cannot stand. The final thing it says in verse 6, he's dismissal from the congregation of the righteous. You see, you can be in a group of Christians, in a church group, and you can fool the congregation for a while, but you can't fool God. Charles Spurgeon said, sinners can't live in heaven. They'd be out of their element. Sooner could a fish live on a tree than a wicked in a paradise. The only way they'll ever be able to enter heaven is to be born again and become a new creation, become one of the blessed. I remember reading a book by author C.S. Lewis several years ago that kind of illustrated this. And in other words, I think it was a case where some of those people in eternal punishment were offered a chance to visit heaven. And so they were taken up to heaven. But you know what? They were unhappy there. They were out of their element. And they were ready to go back to the place of eternal punishment. So they're dismissed from the congregation of the righteousness. His destiny, The last verse says, the way of the ungodly shall perish. That means it'll come to nothing. Now, haven't you heard somebody say, can God really punish us that way? But it's not because we serve a severe or a harsh God, but it's one of those laws of the universe. It's like the law of gravity. If I jump from the 96th floor of a building, the law of gravity says when I hit the bottom, is going to be terrible. It's the same as a law of action and reaction. When you're driving a car and suddenly somebody pulls out in front of you, you're going to hit and there's going to be an accident. This is the law. It's not a law that God is up there waiting to crack down, but it's a law of eternity. The way of the ungodly shall perish. This is an absolute principle in the kingdom of God. Not because we serve a severe God. We serve a loving God. That's just the way things are. Now you notice we've talked about blessed is the man who walketh, and now the second part is the ungodly. The point is here that we choose to be the blessed one or ungodly. It all boils down to that final choice is ours. I don't know about you, but I choose to walk in the discipline, in the delight, and the destiny of the blessed. Thank you for being with us for this session of Biblical Insights with Bob.